All right. Hi, my name is Lisa Connell, and I work in the International Languages and Cultures program at the University of West Georgia. And I'm joined today with my colleague, Dr. Robert Kilpatrick, who is also a professor of French at the University of West Georgia in the International Languages and Cultures program. And I'm delighted to be able to speak with him about the second film in our film festival, Claire Denis' 2008 work, 35 Rhums, or 35 shots of rum, and the questions that inspired viewers of this film. I hope you enjoyed this film, and I do encourage you to continue to take part in our film festival. There are 4 more films that we will be screening from here through the early March. So to bring this into a deeper discussion about 35 Rhums, the film has a very quiet and tender focus about the different relationships that we see unfold, and moves away from traditional strategies such as excessive dialogue and action. And instead, what we have is a very intimate look into the everyday lives of the film's characters, even as viewers are distanced from information about their past and even their future. And like Un Film Dramatique, which was our first film in this festival, we're once again placed in the Saint-Denis region, or the 93rd district, which is right outside of Paris. And this is an area that is home to a large immigrant population in France, which 35 Rhums hints at. But unlike Un Film Dramatique's explicit focus on the 93 and the economic conditions of the students' lives, Denis' focus on place seems to be the microenvironments of the characters' lives, such as apartments, taxis, favorite brasserie, and the control booth of trains, just to name only a few. And the places in the film act to anchor not only the film's poetics, but also its narrative. And so I was wondering, how might you understand the role of place in the film, these strategies that Denis deploys for depicting it? Were there a few moments that in particular help us understand space and place?
That's a great question. Thank you. For me, I mean, there are multiple directions we could go with this, but I think that I'm really drawn to this contrast between the way Saint-Denis is seen on screen in the first film we watched and many other films in France that focus on sort of problems of integration or maybe racial discrimination that some of the people who live in Saint-Denis face on a daily basis. And the way the place and the people in it are represented in this film, the characters seem well integrated into the environment, into the neighborhoods, into the different modes of transportation that we see move through the space as well. And Denis is certainly interested in the way, in the place where these characters live, even in the smallest detail of the decor. So everything is carefully arranged within Lionel and Josephine's home space, for example. There's long sequences of the characters just moving through the domestic space of the home. And so that's really evocative, I think, of what Denis is trying to do in terms of really bringing us in as close as possible to the intimate lives of these characters. Insofar as problems related to integration or economic or political problems are evoked in the film, it's only very indirectly. There's a scene at a university where students are talking about various forms of systemic oppression. And I think that reminds the viewer in some ways that, we're not dealing with, sometimes people talk about colorblind ideas of race in France. It reminds us that there are questions of race that kind of linger in the background, even though they're never brought directly into the story itself. So those are some of the things that struck me. And of course, the use of of various systems of transportation, especially trains and train tracks. You were speaking earlier about something interesting that you noticed with the train tracks. I think that's worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, no, I think your points are really, really interesting in terms of where we see these long lingering sequences of very up close and banal movements, everyday movements that help through the apartment buildings that help constitute the relationships that are housed within these spaces. And I think that this is a very protective space that Denis is establishing within these, particularly Josephine Lionel's apartment space. And I love the fact that you're drawing out the attention to the details that Denis is showing us. Like, so it's a very intentional filmmaking. And I think the idea of this very, very quiet, enclosed space of the apartment building in particular, that's an interesting juxtaposition to all the evocations of movement that we see. So the film opens with a very, very long, lingering sequence of pure movement. So it's just opens up on these train tracks that we see as the camera follows the train tracks. And then eventually we see Lionel, who again gets on another mode of transportation to go home. But I think this lasts for close to 7 minutes. And this is our introduction, our first step into the film. And so it's interesting. I think there's this really unique tension aesthetically that we see through these evocations of movement and these places of stability. And as far as the modes of transportation, these train tracks, I think for me, it tends to make me think about the other forms of passage that the film introduce in the relationships and in the characters' lives. So, and the way that they deal with these moments of transitions, the way that you have to move through different times and spaces in your life, whether it might be, for example, Lionel realizing that he eventually needs to give his daughter Josephine permission, explicit permission to go out and pursue relationships outside of their very, very close bond. We also see this with the character René. So just to remind any viewers here, René is he just retires, and I think that passage into this new space in his life and retirement is something that we don't know if it's what precipitates what will eventually be his suicide, but it is certainly an evocation of his the difficulty of transitioning through different spaces and places in one's lives. And I think that this is something that plays out in different ways. So I wonder, what do you make of Gabrielle, who is the neighbor, as a taxi driver and somebody who has access to the city and this sort of microcosm of the taxi, and somebody and her relationship and the way she fits into the film, into the apartment building itself, is always adjacent to, but available, and in some ways, always trying to gain access to Josephine and Lionel. So what did you make of that?
Right. Well, before we get to that, I wanted to latch on to something you said before, and then I'll circle back to Gabrielle, hopefully naturally. But this image of the train tracks really interests me a lot, and the movement along the rails, because it is evocative of, as you say, sort of the journey through life and the different phases of life. But if we pick up on what you said about René and the sort of danger of leaving that, the way that these modes of transportation circulate also suggest a routine. So there's choices about going in different directions, of course, as you travel, but it's also something that the characters do every day. So they're conductors on the train, and so they go the same route every day, and they return home the same way every day. And so there's a sort of, on the one hand, it's very comforting, but then it sort of, they settle into these routines that are surrounded by a melancholy too, because they realize at a certain point that they can't continue forever. And so Gabrielle, this character, I know fascinated a lot of students in my class, and also interests me a lot. What is her relationship to the other characters in this film? She's also someone who circulates in the city, sort of in this routine way. And that's part of her profession, and she's attached to this family, but not part of the family. So she's got that sort of, she's in that in-between space. We can pick up from her gaze, from her, the way she speaks, that she's very interested in, seems to be very interested in starting a relationship with Lionel. But he doesn't seem so interested, at least at certain moments of the film. And a few students asked why that is. What is it? Why is Leonid not interested? And I think that goes back to this sort of melancholy that the characters feel when they come to a realization that they're moving on from something. So he's a widower. We think we realize that he devoted his life in some ways to his daughter, raising his daughter, forming that small, intimate family unit. And so anything that sort of threatens that, it can be seen as similar to the idea of going into retirement for René, whom you mentioned. Anything that threatens that sort of routine of going through life in that way has a certain danger to it, even if it's attractive in some ways. René, there's a celebration for his retirement. That's a celebratory moment in life in some ways, but it's also one that brings a certain sadness or anxiety about the future. And so I think, to me, Gabrielle occupies that space as well, of something that that threatens the sort of routine of his life, and we're left to wonder at the end of the film whether or not this story of Gabrielle and Lionel will go anywhere. We're not given that answer, and I think we'll probably talk about this later. But that really connects to Claire Denis' idea of narrative. I wanted to, before we go on to something else, I wanted to circle back to the question of place and the domestic space, and this idea of the decor around the characters and the rice cooker specifically. A couple students asked about the rice cooker. What does this symbolize? We see at the beginning that Josephine, the daughter, buys a rice cooker, and that the same night Leonid comes home with a rice cooker of his own that he bought. So they both buy a rice cooker, but when Josephine sees that Leonid bought one on his own, she thanks him and doesn't tell him that she had bought one because she doesn't want him to feel bad. She wants him to have that feeling of done something nice, having done something nice for his daughter. And at the very end, the bookend to that is at the end of the film, Leonid brings out the rice cooker, and we imagine that he's probably known about it all along, or maybe he's just discovering it's not explained explicitly. But this is the moment where he is sort of realizing that it's over. So it's a moment of kind of happiness in a way, because he recognizes, this tender gesture that his daughter made, but also a moment of sadness maybe, and that encapsulates too, I think, some of the ambiguity of the movie. Mm-hmm. So that, but to go back to Gabrielle though, I hadn't thought much about the taxi question and the fact that she is, besides fitting in with the motif of movement and transportation. How did you read that? The idea that her profession is given as a taxi driver.
Well, I think it is like you were saying, how train tracks, like, and there's an expression like in French to be on the rails, right? You're going in a certain place, and you're not, and there's a sense of sort of suffocating security with that, but at the same time, it's a sense of stability, right? So that expression goes in multiple ways in French. And so she is, she's liberated from that, as a taxi driver who's access to the city. She has access to all these different people, and we see the one scene we have the first scene we have of her as a taxi driver is she's talking to this young man who enters into her taxi, and she's giving him sort of a far more expository moment of her day in the life and the frustrations than we ever have from any other character. It's like, oh, this is just not my day. I really want to go to the taxi, all these small fares. So she's just kind of moaning and groaning in ways that we never ever see any other character do in the film.
Oh, that's really interesting. This idea of the taxi and being able to move in different and new spaces that the other characters are very reluctant to enter. That's a great point. That's a great point, and it makes me think about the central scene of the film, which is the dance scene, which they go to because she decides that she pushes everybody to go to this concert together, and then they wind up in the bar, of course, by a total chance because the car breaks down. But that she's the impetus behind that central scene of the film too. She's the motor that gets that going, and we get the idea that without her sort of initiative, these characters would still be going down the tracks of their lives, right?
Well, and there's that moment too, and I think this gets to some of the perhaps some of the student questions about what is going on, what is the precise nature of the relationship between Lionel and Gabrielle. When they are in that taxi together, she says, "Oh, this is the first time we've been together en famille, as a family."
Mhm.
So
Right.
for her, it's very clear that this is a family outing. She's trying to construct it as that. But then the next thing we see is her in this brasserie with a very attractive young owner who ends up dancing with Lionel, and she's like completely excluded from this relationship. And so we never there's this possibility too that Lionel might be with this brasserie owner later on, and that goes to with the fact that she's always sort of circulating around the family with the letter that Josephine reads, and it's
Mhm.
a very soulful, wrenching letter written by Gabrielle, who just wants to be part of the family. She just wants to be close. Um, and so it brings us into this idea about what we have access to, what can we approach through different means, and to some extent. Is Gabrielle successful at that when she's held at bay very
Yeah.
effectively by the energy?
I think we should come back and just take that dance scene head on in a moment. But I just wanted to say that the end of the so the I think Denis' narrative structure, the ending of the film, subverts some conventions, some narrative conventions in really direct ways. And this, usually when you see a marriage at the end of a film, that's a very celebratory moment. It's the resolution, everything comes together, and the conflict is resolved. And yet, it's not much is said, if anything, between between Noé and Josephine. Josephine never really declares her love in any direct way.
Neither does Noé.
Yeah, neither does Noé. They're attracted to each other, obviously, but is this marriage? Is this just sort of an acceptance that life must go on, or is this something that they're enthusiastically entering into? At the same time, there's a Gabrielle is very eager to be part of the preparations for the marriage in that final scene, but Lionel is sort of gruff in his his interactions with Gabrielle, so it doesn't really push us to believe necessarily that they're going to ride off happily into the sunset either. And so the ending is very bittersweet. So these moments placed in the narrative that are usually moments when the story is brought to a close and we're left with sort of a warm feeling. I'm thinking about typical Hollywood narratives, for example, that many students might be familiar with, are subverted and given that tinge of melancholy that we were referring to earlier, like many other scenes, including the dance scene, that maybe we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, no, I think that sets us up really well for another question that a lot of people had about this, and that concerns the very enigmatic nature of the relationships that we see. And so Claire Denis is known for this, right? She's known for enigmatic and elliptical narratives and relationships. And 35 Grammes is no exception. It certainly underscores this aspect. So to go back to this dance scene, might be something to really help us pry open, what are the nature of these relationships? What can we there's a certain rhythm that they all have, and the sparse dialogue and gestures that we see signal of profound comfort, love, and devotion. And so even though our understanding of these narratives are incomplete and always remain incomplete, what do you think are are the more do you find that Claire Denis' depiction of relationships and development of relationships is necessarily subversive? What do you think might be a way to understand this, the way it plays out in the film? Is there a certain moment? Why would this dance scene be so important? Because it does represent a pivot, right? It's no dialogue again, but everything changes in the movie at this point. So what do you take of this dance scene? Is it illuminating about the relationships in any way, or about the stylistics that Denis uses to craft them in her films?
Yeah, I mean I think the dance scene is really, I mean, it's recognized as one of the more masterful sequences in this film or any Claire Denis film, really. But for me, it brings together much of her approach to storytelling in that you don't have dialogue, and so we have to. But she does so much with the acting and the way she directs the acting, the way she uses the camera, that we really have a very profound sense of these characters' emotions. And that's all done through editing. So shot to shot, through the way she brings in the camera really close on the characters so that you can see the expressions on their faces. You can see the way that they, and the way that they look each other. That's again is done with the editing, this sort of shot reverse shot technique, going from one character looking at another couple dancing, characters that are dancing looking at each other, and they go through a range of emotions here, right? So they go from sort of a physical attraction, emotional attraction, to sort of frustration, jealousy, and it's all included in just those few minutes in the dance scene. And so I think that really speaks to Denis' invitation for us to look at the movie, to look beyond words or sort of big actions, uh, to find meaning, to find the emotional texture of the film within those, within a look, or within the way someone moves their body, uh, the way the light might fall on somebody's body, or the way the camera moves. Those things too can make us feel a lot of emotions ourselves as viewers, and can tell us a lot about the interiority of the characters. So it's masterful because the characters don't have to, they never have to tell us in this film what they're feeling. We can always pick it up from the way the scenes are shot, and the way the actors carry themselves, right, under Denis' direction. So I think both the acting and the directing of this action are really critical here. So that's really what stood out to me in that scene. And of course, it captures the ambiguity of the relationship between the characters. We never hear from this woman again. This might have just one moment. So what is this woman that Lionel dances with? What does she symbolize? What does she metaphorically, sort of, what does she represent within this story? Is she's kind of you know, all of the opportunities to have relationships outside of this apartment complex where he lives that Lionel might have had, that he had to give up as he was raising his daughter. It's something that might happen for him down the road if and when Josephine leaves the home. Right? Why does Josephine reject Noé? Not exactly reject him. Why does she refuse to sit there and kiss him? We see that Lionel is it's very difficult for him to watch that moment, when they're being intimate and kissing, and she's not comfortable being in that moment. She doesn't seem ready yet to move past this moment in her life. And it is the central pivot point in the movie, but it's followed by another sort of moment that comes in and shakes things up, which is the death of Noé's cat. And some people picked up on that too, which is this, you know, I think we can relate that to the death of René as this this moment when something ends, something new is going to begin, and it's at that point that Noé is ready to sort of move on to something different. But because he's just been semi-rejected by Josephine, he just announces that he's leaving the country for a job opportunity, and that sort of drives the narrative forward in some regards. But we're not given all the points on that line of the narrative, right? We're only given a few, and we have to make do to fill in the gaps with the gestures and the movements and the light and the sound. And that's what I find really fascinating about Claire Denis in this film and other films that she makes.
And I think that your comment on the light is really interesting because so much of this film is so dark, and it takes place at night or in poorly lit closed brasserie or in the rain, and then some of the few places of illumination are in this domestic space. And so in some ways, it's interesting to see how it opens, and it opens at night, so we know that Lionel has finished his shift. And then the closing scene, which is also part of the parallel with the rice maker, is in a very well lit apartment. So it's kind of bringing another element of this elliptical narrative into it in the way
Mhm.
that light can help show us, and another form of gesture that you were talking about, right? So the very uncomfortable gestures of perhaps dancing and exposing yourself, or the intimacy that you may not be ready for, that we see in the dance scene, but also the very, very comfortable moments that we see, for example, when Noé, Josephine, and Lionel are just eating an omelet together. They don't need to
Mhm.
talk. They feel no pressure to do anything but just enjoy this meal together, standing up. It's very unfussy. And so that shows a very profound level of comfort through their actions, right? That
That's a perfect example, because that's, that how much of a life is told through that 30-second shot of them eating an omelet,
Mhm.
that too. I mean, you don't need something showy like that's a contrast with the dance scene, which is kind of this showy set piece, very virtuosic in terms of the filmmaking too. But when you talk about that scene, that's not virtuosic in terms of filmmaking, but it's accomplishing similar things. So and that too is the mastery of Claire Denis. So how do you take something that's so insignificant in some ways and yet draw a lifetime of meaning out of it? So that's really powerful, right? So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
And I think too that you're bringing up what your questions and your comments are making me think about too, and this is something that other people wondered about, is ultimately what we do and don't know, and what the position that places us in as viewers of a film, and what are we supposed to draw from that, if anything, because it does not seem moralistic or in any kind of way in terms of a film. But there are so many things. So for example, we have the title, we have 35 Rhums, and we have this sort of legend that's built around 35 Rhums. And then Lionel, who never tells the story. And then at one point, when people are trying to get out the story from him, there is he responds, the less you know, the better off we are. So it is this sort of deliberate withholding of information. And this is again repeated at the very end. So it's a very, to get back to the circular nature of Denis' work, we see, and also the melancholia that's associated with something that we would, with an event that would normally be thought of as a happy beginning. This idea of 35 Rhums, very celebratory, is cast in a very ambiguous light, right? So we don't even know if he finishes the 35th shot. The film stops before we even see if this is complete.
He gets to 32, right?
31 or 32, I can't remember. I think it's
I just
30.
want to say that if I had 32 shots of rum, I would not make it to 35.
No one could, and maybe that's the lesson we're supposed to have from 35 Rhums. Don't do it. But so how can we understand the ambiguities in what we do know and what we don't know, and as strategies maybe for approaching that, or what we're supposed to take away from that, or what we can take away from that, or just how we can understand Denis' work
Yeah.
through that lens?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'd like to. Maybe folks could think about if you've seen a biopic or something like that, where that kind of hits on the high points of a character's life, and you get sort of these moments that tell you the whole. The film kind of pretends to tell you someone's whole life through some key, very high profile moments in that person's life. Excuse me. So Denis is taking the opposite approach here, and sort of not giving you any high profile or hugely impactful moments, apart from maybe the dance scene to some extent, but telling you, giving you instead of telling you someone's life, giving you a feel for someone's life. And what that does, so it's sort of the opposite approach. And what that allows you to do as a viewer is to use your imagination to reconstruct that narrative if you want to. But I personally, when viewing this film, that's not really what I was led to do. It was more of a reaction of reflecting on the relationships between the characters and empathizing with, relating to the emotions. So I think there's something really that draws you in and that leads to some kind of self, generates a lot of emotions in the viewer too, I think. Um, uh, as you try to grapple with these emotions that you're seeing on screen. So there's something, just as in the way that the camera is very intimate and how it films these people in their space, there's something pretty, this is just for me again, but there's something, I felt something pretty intimate with how I was reacting to what I was seeing on screen and the characters. So in other words, I'm not really that interested to know necessarily what happens afterwards or what happened before. At a certain point, I kind of just didn't even care about that. It's more like, what am I seeing now?
Mm,
And just relating to kind of the power of those emotions.
mm,
But so the title of the film, 35 Rums, as we discussed before we started filming, it comes from this pirate legend from the Caribbean that Denis found out about or heard at some point. Apparently, this is what she tells in an interview. And at one point she thought about giving more details about it, but decided not to. And viewers may recall that at the beginning of the film, somebody asks Lionel what the 35 Rums, what is this story about the 35 Rums? And all he says is that it's a longue histoire. And then at the end of the film, somebody asks him, so I think you just made up this story of the 35 Rums. And he says, maybe I did. And that's it. So we never even know if this is what kind of story this was, what it means. We're left to fill in those details ourselves. I think we can interpret the symbolic value of it as, the 35 Rums means that you're ready. She explained the original story was this pirate said that when someone took away his daughter to marry her, he would get drunk. Not 35 Rums, but he would get drunk. So that's sort of the origin of the story. So the idea is that, when he's ready to say goodbye to Josephine, when she leaves the family home, then he would drink the 35 Rums. As you point out, we never see him actually finish the 35th Rum. He definitely doesn't at the first scene when Rene retires. But more broadly, what does it symbolize? The 35 Rums is also a suggestion of how Claire Denis works her narrative in this film, because we're never given the story that we want. There's some amount of curiosity, but she never tells us what's behind these characters, what went into shaping these characters and the way they are. We're given details here and there, a few evocations of past events, but nothing that we can really construct in detail. So that creates a certain kind of relationship with the viewer, I think, and draws us in. I guess that would be my takeaway from the title and how it reflects Claire Denis' approach to filmmaking.
mhm. Well, I think that's really interesting too. This refusal to think that we either deserve to know or should be able to know everything in one film, and just and to extrapolate that into an entire life. So allowing these spaces of mystery to unfold almost in real time, which is something we see in a lot of ways throughout 35 Ham, just like the rituals of doing the dishes and doing the laundry. It's a long process that we're allowed access to. And so I think that I think in some ways of that the focus that you're talking about when you're watching this, and the way that it puts us into a very different place as viewers, is something that it's a valuable takeaway. And I think that's probably what resonates so much with viewers of Denis, who is absolutely one of the giants of contemporary French cinema. And so I think that is something that, regardless of how we approach it in 35 Ham, it seems like a valuable thing to keep in mind about other films that she's made.
Yeah, I think it's in films that anybody makes, really. I mean, I think students in our classes can use, how can you apply this to other things that you watch? Pay attention the next time you watch a series on Netflix or a movie, whatever it is. How much time are the characters spending giving you exposition, explaining to you in great detail through long dialogues and conversations why a certain character acted in a certain way, or what the circumstances were behind a certain event? Think about how ubiquitous flashback sequences are in contemporary television narratives. You see them all the time, and they're designed to like fill in every detail that you might want to know about. Think about this if you're a fan of Disney Plus shows, or these Marvel shows or these Star Wars shows, which are great in their own way. But think about the approach to narrative that you see in those, and compare that to Claire Denis, and I think you'll be impressed with how much she can achieve with very little exposition. Exposition, of course, being those moments in a narrative where you kind of stop and explain the backstory for everything, explain why things are happening the way they're happening. She almost dispenses with that entirely. And so what does that enable her to do? What can she achieve by dispensing with exposition? That's an important question to think about. And then you can take that again to other things that you watch or read, for that matter, and think about, is there another way that this could have been handled without 5 minutes of dialogue and a long flashback?
Well, and I think that's a great, I think you're providing a really fantastic segue to the rest of the films in the sequence, and as a way to conclude this conversation that we had, because I think that these are excellent ways to think about the next film, which is a very different film. It's one of our classic film selections. It's a 3-day pass, La Permission, that will be screened this coming week. So from February 21st, I believe.
From February 15th? February 15th it opens, I think. Is that right?
Ahead of myself. So yes, February 15th through the 18th or the 19th. So I think, yes, that invitation to think about different ways of exposition, storytelling, narrative, it's going to be a very different experience as we engage with 3-day pass, La Permission. So thank you very much for your time and for your insights into this very important work by Claire Denis. It's again viewed as one of her masterpiece works within her cinematic project. So again, I can't thank you enough, and I encourage everybody to take part in the rest of our film festival. Okay, so thank you.